Welcome back to Wortheffort Woodworking in our first sophomore level series. I'm calling this the Get Started Woodworking course because we're actually going to get to start making messes. Now, if you haven't seen my prerequisite course, I do suggest you at least peruse that one before you come on here. For the simple reason, there's a lot of foundation level knowledge that you need from that course before you start butchering trees with steel weapons and nuclear powered fiber shredding devices. Now, for those of y'all that are new to the channel, my name is Sean Graham, and for lack of a better term, I am the educator here. I specifically do not reference myself as a teacher, because teaching is a two-way street, and YouTube is not a means of two-way communication. A good teacher does more listening and understanding and drawing information out of the student than they do just regurgitating facts. I have no means of checking for understanding or adjusting the curriculum to suit your needs. The best you can say about this kind of material is I'm an animated textbook and I'm just the puppet host. So I hope you understand that comprehension is kind of on you, the student on the other side of the screen. Having said that, I always like starting out semesters with an easy win. So today, let's build the biggest project we're going to do the entire semester and make you a really solid workbench. Something that you could use for the rest of your life if you wanted to. In fact, I'm using the one I built the same way 20 years ago today in the shop. I call it my no skills required workbench build. Plus, it's cheap and only requires the use of 3 tools. At the end of this video, I'll kind of discuss the overall scope of this Start Woodworking course, the requirements are going to be. I will tell you this right now though, it's going to be very skills based with a limited set of tools. I would rather you learn a new skill than have to buy a new tool. But one of the main tools you need when you start woodworking, especially if you're just the average person out in their shop, is a good, solid workbench. Something that can hold work on its edge, on its face, on its side. And when you're hammering on it, moving on it, pushing on it, it's going to be rock solid. The workbench is your biggest clamp, and I really cannot see being able to make something with a subpar workbench. If one's sitting there and rattling around, or if you're constantly chasing it as you're planing or working or leaning into it, it's no good, and in fact it's somewhat dangerous. So, in a kind of a chicken and egg situation, how do you build a workbench if you don't have a workbench? Well, with that in mind, for this build, which even a slow person would be able to finish in probably a couple of hours, I'm going to push my workbench out of the way, and we ain't going to use it. Now, I haven't been some svelte, athletic, 20, 30-something-year-old model for quite a long time, so unlike a lot of other YouTubers, I'm not going to be working on the ground. If you want to, I'm sure you can find some chairs or a park bench or something like that that you can actually build this workbench on. I'm just going to be using some stools that I happen to have around the shop. In addition, here are the other tools we're going to be using. We are going to need something to cut, construction lumber and plywood, and just a Stanley sharp tooth. These have a hardened teeth on them. It'll last you a good 5-6 years if you're using it like I do. I keep one of these in the back of my truck. This is a small one. It's 20 inches. Would fit in a small toolbox that we might be making in the future. And I think they're a little under 20 bucks. Not a big investment. You're also going to need something to drive screws with. A simple screwdriver is nice, but if you're like me and not in the fittest condition and don't want to be screwing 100 screws in by hand, go get yourself a drill. And FYI, if you're just starting out, look for the little ones with the little tails on them. These are dirt cheap nowadays because everybody's wanting cordless. I am willing to bet if you have a local woodworker or something like that, and you just ask them, hey, I'm starting a little woodworking course, an online woodworking course, and the guy recommended that I get a drill. Do you happen to have any old corded drills that you aren't using anymore that maybe I could buy off you? chances are they'll probably give them to you because most of us have one of these sitting around. And strangely, these are better than a lot of the cordless ones out there because they just have a lot more consistent torque and power. This is the one I'll use for this build. And finally, you're going to need a tape measure. I would include sandpaper, but I don't really consider that much of a tool. I mean, you're going to use that anywhere cheap. You can find something like that. Maybe a clamp, I haven't decided, but there you go. The rest of it is just going to be the materials we're putting into the bench, which are three 4x8 sheet goods. Now, I'm using OSB because it's just dirt cheap and I don't have much money for this project. But I did invest in one piece of sanded pine plywood. That's a 3/4 of an inch. These are 1/2 inch thick. This was about 30 bucks and these were about 10 bucks each. Two 4x4 8-foot long Douglas fir posts, I guess you call them. They were less than $10. I want to say they were like $8 each. Then I bought 10 random species 2x4 stud pines. Not going to use them all. I just got 10 so that I could pick and choose different parts of them. No big deal. So these were $2-3 each. $10, so let's say 30 bucks, 40, 50, 60, 70, plus a $30 sheet of plywood. We're at about 100 bucks. Let's say you go to a pawn shop and go ahead and grab you a corded drill, $10, $15. That saw for $20, so about $135 so far. Now the key to making this bench a lifetime bench is that I'm not going to glue it together. It is going to be completely screwed together so that I can disassemble it, resize the parts, and reassemble it. My first bench for fine woodworking, I was woodworking a long time before I started making furniture, stuff like that, was in an efficiency apartment. And I didn't have a lot of skill or tools, so I built this style of bench using a solid core door as the tabletop. After I used that for a few years, I built myself a very nice bench out of some wood they took out of the high school after a hurricane. They were thrown away. It was some hard maple, and my dad is still using that bench. I used my first bench to build the second bench. But after that second bench, I basically disassembled it and then reassembled it as my sharpening station in my apartment. Later on, when I got a full-size work shop, that became a tool stand for some of my power tools. And right now, it is in my shop, in my office, as a little printer stand. I'm keeping stuff up. So even though I spent money on it way back when, 20 years ago, I'm still using the components. And what made it interchangeable was the corner pieces I use. Simpson's, Stronghold, Strong Touch, whatever, I don't know. They sell a little kit, a box. It consists of 8 parts like this, plus the screws to hold it together. 20 years ago, it was like $24, and I remember that price because it was a stretch for me. But it was so flexible because I didn't have the skills to cut joinery and stuff like that. Nowadays, I just went on Amazon. You can buy the same exact kit I used 20 years ago, and it's a little over... It's right around $45. I think it's $48 after some taxes and shipping to get to me. That used strictly 2x4s. Made an incredibly strong workbench because if you bolt 2x4s together, well, even if you stagger the screws, you only have that much distance to handle the torque. The advantage of these kind of situations is you're putting screws farther apart so that they don't have to deal as much force and they can be a lot more solid. Instead of doing the 2x4s this time, I wanted to use these 4x4s for the legs. So they sell the same exact part for a 4x4 post. It's just it doesn't come in the kit. You have to buy 8 of these and a small box of screws, and those added up to $50, I believe. A little over $50 getting it to me. So you paid a little bit more to use a 4x4 versus a 2x4, and you had to assemble the kit yourself, but still, is just buying 8 of these and a box of screws. Now, my design is going to be really, really simple. I want the top of my bench, that distance right there, to be 34 inches. For no other reason than that's the size of my current workbench and that's the height of my table saw. So if I ever want to stretch pieces across multiple tables or tools, they're all the same. 34 inches is a very standard size for tables in the United States. Next up, it's going to be 2 feet across this way. For no other reason than cutting a 4x8 sheet in half yields you 2 feet. I'm also going to just do it 6 feet lengthwise. Okay? Because that's more than enough to have a couple students on there and plus some tools sitting on the workbench. My current workbench is right around 7 feet in length and just under 2 feet in width. So this is going to be pretty much the same dimensions of the bench I'm currently using. Now we are building the legs out of 4x4s, so they're going to be fairly thick and meaty. I want the front edge that I'm working on to be flush with the tabletop. I'm going to overhang the back about 2 inches, plus or minus 2 inches. That's going to be where a lot of the slop for our no skill inaccuracies are going to show up and won't really matter back there. I also want to have roughly about a 6-inch overhang on one end, and then on the other hand we'll have that 2 inches of slop. That way I can hammer hard on one of the corners and it's going to be transferred straight to a leg, but on the other side I'll also have some space to put clamps and stuff to make it easier to secure stuff, and having a leg maybe 8 inches on the inside to hammer in will allow us to do more stuff with like mortise and tenon, joinery and stuff like that when we're hammering on with a chisel. You're never really going to be hammering in the center, you're always going to be hammering over a leg, so having the option of that leg being both on the edge and inside a little bit will be a nicety. Also, years of experience has told me that I want about a foot underneath my first stretcher. That will allow for easier cleanup of shavings and stuff like that. Plus you have a lot of things like boxes and stuff like that. A lot of them are 12 inches high that you buy, little plastic boxes for storing stuff, so you can actually slide it on the ground underneath your workbench. And the next stretcher is going to be right underneath my table to add some thickness and strength there. So you can do the math on your dimensions, but I do suggest you stick to less than 2 feet or 2 feet for the width of the depth of your table, and about 6 inches, 6 feet for the length, 6 or 7 feet. That extra 2 feet off of that 4x8 sheet, we're going to use to strengthen up the stability of racking for this workbench. So the first thing we're going to do is make the legs. We already know they're going to be 34 inches height minus whatever thickness we have on the workbench. So if we go ahead and cut them 34 inches after we assemble everything and before we put the top down, we can cut it down to that perfect height. Plus the fact that by having the bases right here, if we don't have much skill, well, it is a safe assumption that when you buy the 4x4s, the bottom of both ends are going to be cut perfectly square. So if we use those for the bottoms of our workbench, we know they will sit pretty flat on the ground. So all we really need to do is measure up 34 or 36 inches. I'm going to do 36 from both ends. The actual measurement doesn't matter that much. And then cut them off at those spots. So if you don't cut these perfectly square, trust me, it's not going to matter. You don't have to have developed that skill yet. While it doesn't matter at all if you cut this square or not, I am going to introduce a new tool. Let's call it a fourth tool. It's just a little speed square, plastic speed square. They're a couple bucks at just about any big box store. And This will just allow us to draw straighter lines and maybe make them a little bit squarer, just so we can get some practice on our sawings. Then just saw it down. Now, the easiest way to start a saw is not up here, but it's up towards the tip, because you can't put that much force in it, and pressure is what makes these teeth bite. So if you don't want to, just use your thumb as kind of a guide, place it on there, and that's going to control the direction this way and that way. Then pull it back a few times. Kind of nibble it until you get it started. You get a nice curve. And then the idea is not to use a lot of downward pressure, just to move the saw back and forth and take long strokes. You don't need to draw a big sweat or anything like that. All you want to do is make long, smooth strokes and let the saw do the work. If you find that the board is moving on you, just kind of put it up against your hip, but away from it, so that you can keep your shoulders at about 45 degrees and just your eyeball right on top of the cut. So just take it nice and slow and easy. We're in no rush. We're going to finish this project in a couple hours anyway, so it's not that big a deal. Repeat that 3 times and you'll be done with the legs. So next up, we're going to put the corner brackets on these legs right here. And if you remember, basically what it was is we have a spot right here where the 4x4 is going to go, and the 2x4s are going to rest in these channels. Can you see that? Okay. So the idea originally was that we're going to take the bottom of this leg right here, and we want to come up at least 12 inches so that we can slide boxes and stuff underneath. So I'm just going to slide this on. Be careful with splinters, especially with Douglas fir. And this is unprocessed wood, so we haven't sanded it, so there's going to be splinters everywhere. So I'm just going to slide this down. Remember, this came with the board. This is the cut in. So this is the one we know is going to be square. So I'm making that the foot. Slide it up. Then come over, grab your tape measure. And at least 12 inches. But I want you to notice I'm not going to be too precious about this. And right there, somewhere around 12.5. So once I got that, I'm going to take a pencil, and on one of the flats, that's where I'm going to make the mark. Make it pretty deep. Okay? Then I'm going to slide this all the way up to the top. Now if we remember, we want our workbench to be 34 inches high. I'm going to be using 2 3/4 inch, it's actually a little bit less because it is a cheap stuff, plywood. So that 2 layers of that one equals 1.5 inches. So 34 minus 1.5 inches is 32.5. So I want to come down and measure 32.5 inches off the ground onto my leg. Once again, notice I'm not being overly precious about that measurement. I'm probably within 1/16 of that right there. The problem we have is that the 2x4s actually sit proud of these mechanisms. When you drop them in there, you rest them down, they are a little bit proud. So I cut off a little piece of one of those 2x4s. I'm going to drop it in there, and then I'm going to raise this up until that, one leg down, is even with that 32.5 inches. So that right there will be where my tabletop rests. Add 1.5 inches to that. There's my 34. I'm then going to make a line. So what do I end up with? A board with one line for the top of that and another line underneath it. This now becomes my master. I'm just going to darken up these lines for us. Here is the foot of the leg, the factory cut one. There's the edge we cut. So from here on out, all I need to do is grab another one of the legs, make sure that they're flush on bottom right here, and then transfer that line over. So now they will all be identical. And I also like to transfer it around. Just makes things a little bit easier if you want to make the braces level. Then it's just going to be a simple matter of lining up whatever part you marked off. Remember, I kind of marked the base of it, so I'm going to make sure that those are lined up here. Get the right screws. I'm just using the Simpson ones because it comes, that's what they sold with the kit, so I bought the same box when I was buying the individual parts. And what makes them nice is that they're actually designed to go into this galvanized steel so that they can be left outdoors pretty well. They got a nice wide flat head on them, and I just found that they work pretty well. I've taken these in and out of all the benches. I've never bought a new box for that old bench I built. So one box will handle pretty much one table. It's 100 screws. Now the key thing is you do not want to put any screws on the inside. We're just going to screw the outside for right now. So chuck up a Phillips bit, number 2 I believe, and have at it. As much as you can, you want to get any gap on this outside corner right here. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit more. See that gap right there? So what I would do is I would take that screw. I'm not going to put it in the center. I'm going to put it on the outside. That way as it goes down, it's going to squeeze it that way a little bit. So come in and just screw it down. Do the same thing to the other side. See, this time I'm putting it on the bottom so it'll drag it in that way a little bit. There we go. So just fill up all the holes and then move on. Now remember, on the top one, we mark the top of the leg, not the bottom of it. And you also want to make sure you get the stretchers coming out going the right way. That would be wrong, and you would soon recognize that when you started trying to put the table together. Looky there. Beginning to look like a table, isn't it? Now we want to work on the long and short stretchers. The long ones going the length of it, the short ones going the width of it. Okay. I'm going to start on the short ones and do them as the example and let y'all extrapolate what you're going to do with the long ones for your dimensions. Now, a 4x4 is actually 3.5 by 3.5. After they dimension it all up. There's a long story why they do that in America, but it's 3.5 by 3.5. So if I have one of those here and one of those here, that's 7 inches. Okay? 2 feet is 24 inches, and I'm taking off plus or minus 2 inches. So add 2 here, that's 9. 24 minus 9, we are looking at 15 inches to add up to the total that we want. So this stretcher right here needs to be 15 inches. So I need to cut 4 of those. Now I am going to show you a trick to compensate for the fact that we don't quite have the skill yet to precisely split a knife line. I mean, I'm working with markers. Markers are, you know, a good 1/8 of an inch wide. So in order to compensate for that and to get something that's pretty close to perfectly square, even though we might have our boards ever so slightly differently, there is a trick. But before we do that one, we need to decide what boards we want to use. I will tell you, for the short stretchers, you pick your worst boards. The ones that over 8 feet might have a curve or a bow, because when you only cut out 15 inches of that one, it ends up being pretty straight. But this 6-foot long board, we want our best boards there, the absolute straightest ones. So go through your whatever pile of 2x4s you picked, get the absolute 2 best ones, and they are going to go up top. The 3rd and 4th ones are going to go down here, and the rest you can use for the stretchers going across. So real quickly, I'm going to grab a 2x4. Once again, I'm going to trust that one end of it is fairly square from the factory. Come over, measure off 15 inches. Now remember, we have about 2 inches of playroom. So if you're 1/8 of an inch off or something like that, don't sweat it. So I got my line. I'm going to mark it straight across. I like to have a mark going down, but for this level of accuracy, not really that big a deal. Grab your saw, use your thumb, and as we practice, we want to practice taking the line. I want to saw that line off as best I can without removing any of the wood that's not inked. So just come back, drag it to start it out, create a curve, as little pressure as possible going down. All you're trying to do is move the saw back and forth. Follow that line. I find it easier to just focus on this line right here, so you're going to see me straighten it out and then ride it back up. And once you got it going, a curve established, just have at it. Now from here on out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring that over, and I'm going to rotate this one on top. So that way it's going to mirror itself, picking this corner right here, because I know I started it right on that line. You can still see that line right there. That's going to be wherever I start over here. So I make my mark line there, and then grab this right here to finish up the line. That's going to give me the most accurate measurement, because if this became an angle, at least I knew I started at the right spot. So if I move this over and I'm flushing up this side and measuring it over here, these two are going to be identical. So this now becomes my master, and that's the edge I want to measure off of. Or if you trust your measuring skills, just measure 15 inches off each time. No big deal. Remember, if you're, an eighth, 16th off, it's not going to make that big a difference. I just do this one because I assume my measurements were off, in error. But if all four pieces are exactly the same error, it won't matter. If you have one that's a ½ inch one way, one that's it gets harder to deal with those errors. Now that you got the short sides, decide which of these are going to be the short side. I don't really think it matters too much. And then you can just drop them in. Now, whenever you screw these in, do not screw the insides. Just screw the outsides first until we get the entire table assembled. And then we'll use the inside to cinch it square. But as you can see, it's going to be pretty good. If you do have a clamp though, using a clamp while you're screwing it down will make your life a little bit easier. But I'm not going to use one. That's the last screw for me on the outside. So now just kind of check it, make sure it's somewhat square. If it's a little bit out, you can kind of bang them on the opposite corners. When I say by square, just measure from corner to corner, and it's going to be pretty close. Don't stress about it. If I could show you, I got gaps on some of these corners and not. Again, it's just a workbench. It's your very first workbench. You're going to beat it up, and later on you're going to repurpose it. But it's going to be sturdy, strong, not rack, all that other kind of stuff that on all the store-bought workbenches everybody curses about. You're building something that's going to be rock solid. So now, just put in all the screws on the inside, and then we'll brace it up even further. And when you get the last screw in, go ahead, pick up one of the sides, wiggle it around, feel. No rack in here, but let's make it even better. Now next up, I want to add some substructure for the tabletop so that if you're pressing in the middle, we are sheet goods, we don't want a lot of flex in it. We want it to be as secure as the frame is, so to speak. So the easiest way I know to do that one is just simply screw in some 2x4s in between them, but we've got to make sure that they are dead flush here. We can't have any variation along that top, otherwise we're going to have to get another tool to plane it down, and obviously we only have the 3 or 4 tools, plus a few clamps. Now I brought the clamps out here because that's the way I'm going to do it, but if you don't have clamps yet, I'm first going to show you how to do it without clamps. The first thing you want to do is go ahead and grab a board right like this. Make sure that it is as flat as absolutely possible. Now, having a pair of clamps would make this a lot easier for holding this in here. But if you don't have it, don't stress about it. It is something that you're going to want to get in this course, just some clamps to do stuff. But if you can just grab a screw and screw it in from underneath, that'll hold it for this time. FYI, I am going to be switching to a little impact driver I have for no other reason than the screws I'm now using use a Torx bit, and I only have the short kind of bits, and this one works with that one. It doesn't really work very well with the other drill I have. It likes a longer bit, so I'm just switching that one because I don't have the right bit. The key thing is you want to make sure it's up tight so that when we put our board here to rest on it, we know it will be dead even on top. Now, at this point in time, you've cut over a dozen boards, from the 4x4s to the 2x4s, and you started out cutting the 4x4s, which were much harder. I did that on purpose because I wanted you to get a feel for that motion of just letting it glide through there. It was basically 4 times you got to practice cutting a 2x4, which I almost guarantee the last 2x4 you cut went like a breeze. So at this point in time, I want you to focus a little bit more on getting nice straight cuts on the lines you put with that little square. Because they are going to be, we don't want these to twist as we screw them down to the boards. We also kind of want to take away any bow that might be in here, you know, a curving like that. So the first thing we want to do is get one measurement that's going to be consistent for every single board you put in here. What we don't want to do is take this measurement and cut it perfectly, because this right here is 19 1/4. This right here is 19, so there's a 1/4 of a difference of flex in these boards in the middle on my setup. It's going to be probably different for you. What we want is a good consistent number. And this number on this side and this number on that side are identical. So I basically want to make them all this length so that it will squeeze this, this, and this to be parallel. So mark your distance very, very carefully. Make sure you get a nice square line. Hopefully this little plastic thing of yours is square. They aren't always, they can be like a ½ a degree off, but for this purposes, it's okay. And we are using a pencil line here, which is fairly thick, so it gives you a lot of room. But when you're sawing this time, I want you to take your time. I don't want you to rush it. Weight the end with your knee, bring your thumb up, and I want you to focus this time on leaving the line, but not any white on the other side. So that if you do it perfectly, you will still be able to see the lead. So draw it back. If you don't get started perfectly, that's fine. You can adjust it one way or the other. It's entirely up to you. Draw it back a few times. And then very easily saw through it. Nice, long strokes. Use your breath to blow away the sawdust. And just follow that line as best you can. Now, if it isn't perfect, don't worry about it. This is just a workbench. It's not going to be your last workbench, but it is going to be a great workbench. So take your time, saw to the line, smooth, even strokes. If you did it okay, not perfect, but a little bit of lead is still there. And just like last time, I'm going to use this as a master because I don't want to do all that measuring again. Bump up the end as best I can, and then just mark it across. That way all of them will be the same. And if I can get 2 out of one of the scrap pieces, I'll do it. Just make sure you mark away the waste side of that line so you don't saw on the other side. Once you got either the clamp or the screw with that base, it's just a simple matter of kind of lining up the center of the cross piece right on those lines for you. Dropping it down. Checking that it's going to be dead flush. And then putting a couple screws into it. Now when you do this, definitely sink these. Do not leave them flush. I want you to sink them. Because if you don't, if you ever clamp anything to this, it could like leave a little circular dent in them. We want it below the surface. So there's no chance of that. Look at that. Pretty solid and stiff. You feeling accomplished yet? Well, you should be, because there are woodworkers out there that haven't built anything as rigid as this in their career, and the workbenches they have just frustrate them out because they rack on them. This thing ain't moving and we aren't even done yet. Next up, we just need to flush up these leg posts with this top rail. And here's a trick to do that. By leaving these long and flushing them up after the fact, you in effect have made a jig to hold your saw to do the sawing. Just lay it on top and have at it. Do that 4 times and your legs will be perfectly parallel with your sides. At this point in time, you go on, grab a scrap piece of plywood and a piece of sandpaper. Just kind of wrap it around. And go ahead and hit anything that you want sand on your frame so far. So now we're going to move on to making the top. And I need to warn you, don't be stupid like me. Don't buy your sheet goods like this. Buy them like this. You see, most big box stores will cut sheets down for you. I believe you get 1 cut per sheet for free. So we bought 3 sheets and we're only going to ask for 2 cuts. Just cut, you know, I wanted a 6-foot tabletop. These are 8 foot, so I stacked 2 sheets up and I asked them to cut 2 feet across the top. There's 1 cut. Then they laid them on the side and I asked them to just split it in half so I get 2 feet on either side. So I end up with 4 2-foot by 6-foot sections. They're top offcuts and 1 big sheet left over. We're almost done. Now I'm going to laminate these 2 plywood pieces for my top, as I mentioned earlier before. And I'm going to use one of the OSB pieces as a shelf on bottom, which gives me these 2 pieces that I can use to reinforce the entire structure even stiffer. But whenever you're getting the big box store to cut it down, sometimes, you know, they have very old blades in those cutters, and sometimes the guy doing it is a complete idiot. So give yourself some room. You know, we had 2 inches on one side, 6 inches on the other, so if he got the total length a little bit off, it's not going to be that big a deal. If he didn't cut it dead perfect in half, we have some about 2 inches out there, so hopefully he's not going to get too far off. But you can somewhat measure and check it for him if you want with a pencil. But the thing is, more than likely the cut they do on their machine is going to be straighter or cleaner than the cut that came from the factory. You just decide which is cleaner, and that's going to be the face on the good side of your bench. The one that's going to be flush up. So the first thing we need to do is decide what side of our bench we want to do most of our work on. Make that the better side. Then on that front side, either clamp or screw some 2x4 scraps so that they will be flush up. You know, give you something to bump that plywood tabletop up against. Do a quick test fit with one of the boards. Remember, on one side I'm only doing a small, 2-inch overhang. The rest is going to be on the other side. So get it somewhat lined up the way you like it, and then come over here and make sure that this side is fitting flush. This will tell you just in case the guys at the store maybe cut a curve or something like that. Since we have an overhang on back, that curve can be on the outside and you can use a factory edge on the front if you need to. After that, grab some glue, and I'm going to be putting glue on all the long grain sections, but not here. We have maybe $4 in 2x4s all the way across this top, so I view these as sacrificial. So if I ever rebuild this using the hardware, the expensive hardware, I like to be able to use a leg. So I'm not going to glue the legs to the top, but if I were to ever unscrew it and remove the top, these will come with it, and I can just make more of these. So the glue will just solidify everything. Then screw the top down. Starting with this front section, it's really, really important that that side 2x4 and the plywood are flush. That's what we got to lock in. Now I want you to notice two things. The wood screws I am using, they have a smooth shank that is almost exactly the size of my plywood. So that way it's not going to grip the plywood except for the head, and these will cinch it down. They'll actually pull this down. So if there's any waviness in the tabletop, it's not going to match my substructure. Also, I'm going to be driving them down so that they are recessed underneath the level of my top. So now you can see a little bit of glue squeeze out. Just perfect, but it's nice and flush. That's a key part. Now to anchor it into these center beams, basically I just found the screw holes on either side right there, drew a line and then connected them, and I knew I would be hitting that beam. You could hear nice and solid. But we can't have any schmutz from any fibers that came out, so go ahead and sand all your screw holes nice and smooth so that the other piece of plywood will have a nice place to anchor down into. Next, I'm going to put a bead of glue about 1 inch from the edge all the way around. Then on the interior, I just dump it. Don't be bashful with the glue. Glue's cheap. Give it a good spreading. This doesn't have to be perfect. You're just getting it so it's not going to goop up anywhere. This is more than enough adhesion for what we're doing. Then it's just a matter of repeating what you did earlier. Popping it down. Now, if you're concerned with the cosmetics of the top of your bench, do the same screwing that I did earlier, but screw it from underneath, and then remove those screws after the glue is set. We're just using the screws as clamps. If you kind of trust that this is very flat, you can get a bunch of weights and just weight on the front, and the glue will set there. Me, I'm not concerned with the top. In fact, because I don't want y'all to have to spend a lot of money on clamps and stuff like that, we're going to be screwing into this. This to me is disposable. If you keep this workbench for your entire life and you have to replace the top every 5-10 years, well, that piece of plywood was 30 bucks, and again, maybe 10 bucks worth of 2x4s. Unscrew it all, throw this away, put a new one on. That seems like a reasonable trade for not having to buy hundreds of clamps. So I'm just going to put a bunch of screws through the top, and then I'm going to remove them so that I don't have any metal in this top other than along those lines for future work. Walk around, make sure you don't have any gaps. And after that, we can use this bench to make the shelf to go underneath. So we've got the back side of our workbench. So I'm going to take that offcut from the top of that 4x8 sheet. I'm just going to drop it up on, lift it up here, secure it underneath, and then take a pencil and draw a line right where that 2x4 is. I'm also going to measure between these two 2x4s. So that is 30, so I'm going to go 32 inches. So 32 inches from each side. Grab a straight edge, mark a line, move it ever so slightly off the edge. One clamp here, one clamp there. Grab your saw and have at it. Break your edges. Clamp it up, make sure it's very tight along the top for added strength, and then just screw it on. We are not gluing this because I want to be able to remove this at some point in time when I build a new bench. But whenever you are screwing these in, don't just put the screws in a row. Kind of zigzag them so that you'll get maximum strength. Do that for the top and bottom. So my shelf needs to be 63 inches long, and remember, we cut the top off at the big box store, or you had it cut off, so that's going to be a clean edge. And on OSB, the edges are always crappy, and they split it, so that's going to be a clean edge. So I'm just going to take off the yucky edge on this side. Draw a line. It's slightly off the edge. Clamp it down. Saw line. You're going to hear a recurring theme when you work at a workbench. Now the interior, if you remember, we made this smaller than 24 inches so we could have that overhang. So I'm just going to measure it right now. Right at 22 inches. So I just need to do the same exact thing. Come from the edge, mark out 22 inches, clamp it down, saw to the line. Now the big thing with working at a workbench is it's just a big huge clamp. And if you don't have a lot of fancy clamps, one reason why I like having a disposable top is, well, I know I'm going to cut this corner out to fit around the leg. So I'm just going to screw it down to my workbench. That's the cheapest clamp I can think of. And grab your saw and get to work at sawing that line. Voila! Break those edges because OSB is sharp and splintering. When you're done, just take the screw out. All that's left is a tiny hole. No big deal. Now obviously the edge I cut with a handsaw is not going to be as smooth as the one cut by the machine or from the factory, so we'll just put that in the back. So we got it to fit, except we still had the legs in to mark out. The easiest way I know to do that one is just to grab one of the offcuts when we did over to level out the top. And by holding my pencil flat like this, I'm going to get that little bit over from the side. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger than that actually is. And once again, as you will hear time and time again from a hand tool woodworker, first you mark the line, then you saw the line. So I've marked it. Move it slightly over the edge of my workbench, clamp it down, saw it off. Okay, maybe I'm just stupid, but I can't figure out how to fit this thing in here. So I'm just going to split it in half along one of these 2x4s that I've got as a support. It'll make it a lot easier. Well, looky there, 34 being such a common dimension in tables, that's what height the back of this chair is. Just enough for me to get it slightly offside my bench and saw to the line. Voila. Now they fit. And you do want to screw these down because they will enhance the stability of the entire bench. Well, looky what I ended up with. Nice solid workbench. Not too big, not too heavy. Pretty good. Definitely doesn't rack. We've proven that before. But let's see, does it meet all the requirements we have of, like, my old workbench? Can I cross-cut on it? Well, a couple bench hooks, cross-cut saw, something to saw. Sure. Can I lean into it? Sure. I mean, my 300-pound butt is pushing hard. How about, can we cut upright, like cutting dovetails? Well, because I have this flush now, I can always just come over here and just using a normal bar clamp, clamp it to the workbench, close to its edge. That might be cumbersome to put two of them on there. So if I know I'm doing a lot of dovetailing, well, there's a reason why everyone likes twin screws so much. And I now have a nice little twin screw. I can always also put that Moxon vise that I'm always using on my old workbench right on the end, just as I do right with it. And I could even screw that down and just leave it permanently on. But this will work. I can work all day long like that. Just swap out a board, loosen it up, go grab another. If I need to do something like plane a long board, well, once again, because we have a flush front, use the same twin screw as a crochet. Or I can actually install crochet permanently right here, and then just put a clamp on this side for this board to rest on. And what do I have? An easy way to plane stuff. And heaven forbid, you just screw one of those to your workbench and have a permanent crochet or bird's mouth right in the corner to plane into. In fact, y'all watch my channel, you know me, I'm never going to do this kind of setup. I generally put up a dog hole right up front and just push into it. You know, a little bit of experience and you don't have to worry about it slopping around. So how can you do that? Just clamp a board going straight across, reach over, grab your hand plane, bump it up, and plane away. Oops, it's going against the grain. But right here, we might find one error with this workbench. when I start putting all my weight and effort into going one direction, can you see it? Every stroke, it moves maybe a couple millimeters. I'm walking across my showroom floor. Granted, I could always put some rubber floor mats underneath the legs. That's how I took care of it with my my big bench, because that's made out of poplar and it's not that much heavier than this thing right here. But there's a much more permanent solution to having your workbench creep on you as you're planning or pushing against it. Have y'all forgotten about that third sheet good? That less than $10 OSB board? By connecting the workbench to a platform that I am now part of, this thing can't walk away from me. If it wants to move away from me, it has to take me with it. My body weight is actually part of the equation now, and it makes this kind of setup so much more stable. This is a very time-honored way of making lightweight workbenches not walk. It's physics. Now, granted, I probably would not leave that platform there for my personal use and for the rest of the series, for the simple reason I'm doing a lot of other stuff in the shop. And I'm going to need to, move the workbench around to get it out of the way for that kind of stuff. So to solve that problem, I'm probably going to do the same exact thing I did to my main workbench, is go buy a rubber doormat and then cut out the little squares and glue them to the bottom of the legs. That little extra traction seems to be all I really need to make these things not walk. And if it walks a little bit, it happens. Well, I hope you recognize what we have accomplished here. We now have a workbench that a lot of professional woodworkers would be envious of compared to what they started out with and what all the hiccups they had with it. Workbenches, the ones you buy, even for $400, $500, $600, they aren't going to be as solid as something we built for a little over $100 if you take away the tools. Add in the tools, and you're probably right around $200. $200 plus the tools. We used a little $20 20-inch saw. I started out using that drill, but because of the bit, I ended up with this one. But you can find drills like this all over the place. Buy them used, new, borrow them, whatever. Tape measure, I added in a square, and I started using clamps, but I did give you an alternative that you could use screws with them, so the clamps aren't necessary. And a little sandpaper. Very limited amount of tools, and look at what you could accomplish. Now, I call this the no-skill workbench, but by the time we finished it, you have a lot of experience sawing. I'm willing to bet you're capable of sawing a straight line just like I did for the entire 6-foot length. You know how awesome that is? And that's kind of where we will be going in this Get Started Woodworking series. This right here is the foundation. This is where we will be working. This is something you can build in a garage, put it against the wall, and still have plenty of room for your car. We will be focusing on hand tools, something you could be storing up underneath the bench. In fact, my idea is using the set of tools that I had when I started fine woodworking in the corner of an apartment on that kind of bench that I showed you earlier. Not too many, a few chisels, a few saws, maybe one carcass saw, a block plane, maybe a jack plane. Very rudimentary amount of tools that you do not have to spend a lot of money on. This really is going to be a skills-based series, not a tool acquisition-based series. But it's not going to be all hand tools. We'll probably use drills, so there'll probably be egg beaters also. But there's one power tool that I've always told people that I don't want to woodwork without. And a lot of people don't believe that you could base an entire workshop around just this one power tool. A small 10-inch bandsaw. A bandsaw opens up so much opportunity for a new woodworker, and it takes away quite a bit of the stress and the time it takes to develop a skill. You can work on your hand sawing skills and still use the bandsaw. Plus it opens up material options. We can buy rough wood. We can use wood from trees. There's a lot of different opportunities that a bandsaw opens up that other power tools don't. In fact, most other power tools, in my mind, are more built for repetitive work, production work, where the bandsaw, by the nature of how it works, is as close to a hand tool as I can think of. And we will talk a lot more about the bandsaw and one of the most fundamental tools in all of woodworking in the second episode of the series. Well, I hope you're as excited as I am about this series. This is something I've wanted to do for quite a long time. A very small set of tools to teach skills and bring in a lot of academia into the learning environment so that you can understand why we do things a certain way. There is an explanation. It's not just this is the way it's always been done. And my real hope is that a lot of y'all, the audience, will use the lessons you find I do. This workbench build, I would love for you to do it with somebody else, to teach somebody else, to use this as the fuse to light a whole new hobby or a teaching avenue. I know a lot of y'all are stuck at home nowadays and are looking for lessons you can teach your teens and older kids. Hey, start with them at the same skill level and progress with us as we go through this Get Started Woodworking series. And please understand, series like this, made by me and many other people out there, we all kind of do this on a value proposition. This is the kind of stuff that takes money and time. I mean, this is not a workbench that I needed or really wanted, but I kind of have to have it in order to teach the series. After the series is gone, I will probably give it to a local school or something like that. But it's capital I had to invest, and it's time I had to invest. So if you're getting good value out of this, or maybe you understand that other people will, maybe consider helping us out a little bit and looking down the description to see all the ways you can patronize the channel. But the last thing I want you to remember is that it is always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Y'all be safe and have fun.